Green. This evening, Books and Books is very happy to present Ms. Kim Schneiderman, presenting her new book, Step Out of Your Story. Ms. Schneiderman counsels in private practice, writes for a variety of readerships in print and online, and teaches as a professor and guest lecturer in venues including New York University. Every day, we relate stories about our highs and lows, heartaches and joys, relationships and jobs. But do we ever consider the choices we make about how to tell our story? In this book, Ms. Schneiderman shows us that by choosing a different version, we can redirect our energy and narrative toward our desires and goals. She can explain this much better than I can, so please give a very warm welcome to Kim Schneiderman.
So thank you so much. So first of all, I just want to thank Books and Books for inviting me to speak here tonight. Before I came here, I heard wonderful things about this bookstore, and I have to say, having been here for the last hour, it certainly lives up to all the hype. It's a pretty amazing place. So this is my first book, and this is actually the last stop of my book tour. And this morning, as I was getting out of the ocean, because we can only do this in Florida, I was thinking that it's so fitting that I'm actually finishing my book tour in Florida, because it was here about 3.5 years ago, when I was caring for my father, who was in hospice care at the time, that sort of the seeds that had been planted for this book really started to germinate. And I had been working with an agent, and we had worked on several versions of the proposal, and finally it sort of started to gel. And she said to me, and then I was invited also to become a columnist for the New York, Boston, and Philadelphia Metro newspapers. And she said to me, "You know what, Kim, we're going to get this book published now." And lo and behold, here I am. So it's really such a pleasure to be here today, and especially to look out in the audience and see so many people from this very important chapter in my life, and people that have been in my life for a very long time. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to begin the evening with a visualization. And this will sort of set the stage for our journey together. So I invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable. And just imagine walking into a neighborhood bookstore, like this one, and discovering a novel with a familiar picture on the cover. Flipping through the pages, you are struck by the eerie sense that you've read this book before. As you begin to recognize characters and scenes, wincing at some and smiling at others, you realize that this is the story of your life, and that you are actually the hero of that story. Now imagine that this book stops just a few months, or even maybe a few weeks, depending on you, before today, and you have an opportunity to write the current chapter of your story. What title would you give that chapter? And just think for a moment. What title would you give that chapter? What does the protagonist of this story want? What is he or she seeking? What's getting in the way, if anything? And what are the stakes involved? Now ask yourself, how would you like to see the character of that story evolve? If you were reading the story, what actions or outcomes would you root for? And perhaps you might want to think about why the character was being placed in this particular situation at this particular time. Okay. And now you can open your eyes. So you've just had a taste of what it means to step out of your story, and now we're done. No, I'm just kidding. No. So the premise of this book is that every life is an unfolding story, a unique, dynamic, unpredictable, and potentially heroic story that is open to interpretation, especially your own. Right? From the day we were born, we become both the star and the spin doctor of our own work in progress. Yet few of us really take time to stop and think about, like, who is this character am I playing? What's my story about? Who's writing my script? Or how can the challenges that I'm facing help me to develop into a fuller, a deeper, fuller expression of who I really am? And so what this book offers is a series of structured writing exercises that help you really imagine yourself as the star of your own story with the power to reclaim and reframe your personal narrative. And as I tell all, this was actually a workshop many years ago that I developed into a book. And as I always tell my writing students, that this is really not about writing well, it's about using writing as a tool for self-discovery. So what I'd like to do now, I'm going to put a bookmark there, and I'd like to read the preface sort of as a means of explaining the genesis of my ideas, and also just to illustrate how I was personally able to reframe a difficult chapter in my life. So, and once we're done with that, I'm going to kind of give you a quick book tour and read a bit more, and then we'll wrap it up and take questions. Okay. When I was a little girl, I used to sign my name, Kim S., in person. Between my highly active imagination, my obsession with Nancy Drew books, and my daily diet of television, I had the uncanny sense that I was character in the story. I couldn't exactly say why or who was watching. Perhaps it's because of my well-meaning but marginally overbearing parents, or the inflated sense of self-importance that afflicts many would-be writers who imagine themselves as the stars of their own terribly compelling dramas. My sense of being a character, though, tempered by maturity, followed me into adulthood, where I kept it under wraps, while secretly turning to my Kim S. alter ego in times of stress. Whenever I had an why me moment, times when I felt victimized by difficult people or circumstances, I'd imagine reading about the exact same situation in a novel. First, I would ask myself, what would I hope the main character would do in response to these circumstances? What actions or outcomes would I root for as the reader of the story? Second, because I appreciate good character development in novels, I'd wonder, why would a benevolent author place this character in this particular situation? And what might this situation be teaching her? Finally, because I see life as a spiritual story that I'm co-authoring, how might she make the most of the situation to become a stronger, more compassionate human being? The answers to these questions and similar lines of inquiry helped me successfully navigate many challenging chapters in my life, emerging from them as a stronger, wiser, and happier person. Enhanced by my insights as a psychotherapist and journalist, such questions became the basis for a series of writing workshops I began offering around the New York metropolitan area in 2008. My hope that with self-exploratory writing exercises in the third-person voice could help participants, many of whom had been impacted by the recession, and it was a very tough time in New York, reframe their losses as stepping stones to a richer spiritual life and a deeper sense of self. Like the protagonists in many stories, my Pollyannish premise was soon put to the test. In February of 2012, my 72-year-old father developed an aggressive form of cancer that took his life a few months later. Suddenly, I was a single, middle-aged orphan. My father's death was the third cancer in my small and immediate family in 7 years. In 2005, my 61-year-old mother lost her decade-long battle with ovarian cancer. Less than a year later, my father found love again. 4 years later, his girlfriend died after a year-long battle with lung cancer, also at 61. After experiencing so many devastating losses, I had to ask myself, could I walk my own talk? Did I truly believe that I had the power to transfer my tragedies into triumphs simply by choosing to widen the lens through which I viewed my own story? Yes, I did, but understanding how requires reading between the lines. My father was the antagonist of my childhood story. The external narrative, how it looked from the outside, was that he was a good provider who worked tirelessly to offer his children all the opportunities he had been denied growing up in a working-class Jewish family in the Bronx. Yet the internal story, how I experienced him, was quite different. I never felt he really understood me. He was a benevolent despot of sorts, and his "because I told you so" was never a satisfying response to all my important why questions. Because I was equally headstrong, I challenged him and I made my mother my confidant. When I graduated college, I moved to San Francisco, putting several cities and mountain ranges between us. Yet our story took an unexpected positive turn after my mother died and I moved back to New York. Suddenly, my father and I were spending more time together, grieving my mother over Chinese food, biking up the northern Westchester trails, sharing our mutual love of dance, and flying to California for family gatherings. I was older and wiser, and having undergone years of therapy, I had come to appreciate my father's many positive attributes without taking his rougher edges quite so personally. It wasn't until my father suddenly became ill that our father-daughter narrative reached its inevitable climax. It's December 2011. My father, who has recently moved to Florida, has just been transferred to from intensive care to a hospice unit at Delray Medical Center, less than a mile from his new home in Boca Raton. The admitting nurse explains that he needs 24-hour supervision to receive services at home. My brother is immersed in a rigorous master's program at Cornell University. I've been my father's primary health advocate for the past 3 months, flying back and forth between my life in New York and Florida. Hiring a full-time aide is not only unaffordable, it's also unthinkable. So I decided to take a leave of absence from my private practice, my friends, my community, and my frenetic but full life in Manhattan to care for my dad. It's been 18 years since we lived under the same roof. The last time he was my provider. Now the tables are not only turned, they are covered with painkiller cocktails, insure, and a stockpile of sweets. Over the next 2 months, I fix his meals, administer his meds, clean his house, learn to manage his finances, and hold his hand both figuratively and literally through waves of fear and pain. Despite the stress, which I alleviate with exercise and beach walks, because there's nothing like Florida, I feel my heart softening and expanding. My father and I share surprising moments of tears and laughter. We come to appreciate each other's minds, feelings, and strengths more deeply. Old friends and family show up to talk about the good old times, offer support, and say their goodbyes. I reconnect with long-lost relatives and see how fortunate I am to have such a supportive community of friends and family. As this new and final chapter in our story continues to cook us, all our oniony father-daughter pungency melts into sweetness. One evening, my father tells me that despite his fear and misery, he can't believe he is still learning and growing. I ask what he means, and he responds that people have found a way to love me, and I have found a way to love them. That's all he ever wanted. That's all anyone ever wants, isn't it? Today I realize there are many ways to spin my story. Mine is but one version. Others might tell it differently. As both the narrator and protagonist of my narrative, I exercise my authorship rights to tell it as a story of love and redemption, of the prodigal daughter, perhaps. I also recognize that not all stories end in redemption. There is a place in the world for sadness. The more tragic the event, the more difficult it can be to put our faith in an empowering narrative. Some events, war, genocide, terrorism, disease, and poverty, can lead us to question the stories we've always taken for granted. They defy the comforting plot lines or the pre-existing narratives we have created about divinity, humanity, and justice. Had I been given a choice, I would have chosen another storyline and resolution for my life lessons. But for now, I embrace the gifts of my bittersweet fortune. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So sometimes the story of your life reads like a comedy, and other times like a tragedy. But if you read the text through the proper lens, you can always read your story as a personal growth adventure. So, what does that really mean? What does it mean to read your life or read your story as a personal growth adventure? And what do I mean by the proper lens? As you know, there are infinite ways to tell the same story. The story that you tell to your best friend or your husband and wife or your boss may all be a little bit different, right? And of course, and oh wait, and and does it matter how we tell our story? Does it matter how we tell her? Anybody want to? Does it matter?
Yes.
Yes, it does. Why does it matter?
Because of how you choose to frame it to communicate what you need to communicate to the other person.
Right. But it also, so it depends how we frame it, communicates something to the other person, but it also changes the way that we feel. It affects the way we feel about it. Because how we feel, right? So how we tell our story affects the way that we feel about our story, which can influence the way that it unfolds, right? Because people respond to a story told in a particular way, and we can feel it in our bodies when we tell a story that feels kind of right. And while it's true that we can't always control what happens in the plot line of our life narrative, we can take charge of, our story's narration and actively mine it for positive meaning. And that is truly that's truly the power of interpretation is really the heart of our power as co-authors of our story. So, so then that begs the question of how do we tell a story? How do we tell our story in a way that leaves us feeling empowered by the telling, but doesn't really kind of like gloss over the hard parts, right? Because we want to we want to tell. People always say, "Well, isn't there like a true way to tell the story?" And I usually respond by saying, you know what? There's many ways to tell this story. I'm less concerned about whether the story is true than whether it's constructive. And a real story, just like the one I told you a few minutes ago about my dad, it has room for all of the various. It has room for the pain and the sorrow, but there's always an opportunity to read it as a growth story. So, so in my book, when I ask the question, how do we tell our story that leaves us feeling empowered? In my book, I offer 2 techniques. One of them is all the exercises are framed in a third-person narrative. So this is not just a clever gimmick, but it's actually based on a growing body of research that shows that when we write, think, and speak about ourselves in the third person, and that kind of excludes Donald Trump. He's not. It's not like a different book. That when we talk about when we think about ourselves in the third person, we tend to view our lives much more compassionately, and what it does, it sort of like gives us some emotional distance from our storyline. And what I like to call it the sneaky perspective, because you're like kind of like fooling the censoring ego. The ego is very attached to the I, right? But when you write about yourself as a he or a she, you're sort of fooling the censoring ego into thinking that you're writing about somebody else, right? You're not writing about you, you're writing about some character in a story, wink, wink, right? So, so this technique, which actually, I mean, whenever I give writing workshops, sometimes when I announce to people that all the exercises are going to be in the third person, people kind of give me these very dubious looks, like, really? That's a little weird. And I just said, just try it. And usually once they actually start doing it, they're just amazed at the kind of insights they're able to have once they actually allow themselves to write from this perspective. So it might sound like a small shift, but it really works. Because I think it really allows us to sort of access like that. Some people are into meditation or yoga, the observing mind, right? To tap into that omniscient narrator that can kind of see the broader perspective that we sometimes can't access because we're so worried in trying to protect the I. So that's the third person narrative. And then actually the third person narrative also enables us to be kind of more curious about our story adventure, right? It's kind of like, if I'm a character in a story, I can maybe, I can maybe assume, be curious about how is my story going to unfold, And that sense, it creates more of a sense of adventure rather than kind of like the anxiety that a lot of people have about what comes next. So this writing from the third person narrative is the first technique, and the second technique I use, or really the frame I use, is what I call the story lens on life. And actually, if people remember from their elementary school English lesson, right? In every story, there's a protagonist, right? And there's an antagonist. And the tension between the two sort of creates the friction that moves the story forward. And in the beginning, you have like a kind of, I'm sure you remember the story arc, right? From that your teacher might have drawn on the board. So in the beginning, you have the exposition where you're sort of, the reader is sort of introduced to the characters, and you kind of find out who they are and what they're all about and where they live and who their friends are. And then after you've kind of gotten like settled and like understanding what's kind of going on, something changes, right? So the antagonist shows up and just shakes up the entire story. So you're moving along and you've got the exposition, and then the antagonist shows up and and creates a conflict. And the conflict, which is the tension between the protagonist and the antagonist, creates sort of the energy and the momentum that propels the story forward. And as until it crescendos to like the climax of the story, which is like the ultimate showdown, and then gradually it sort of unwinds. So I use the story arc as it's kind of like an architecture to help people deconstruct and reconstruct that story. So what does that look like, right? Because it might seem a little bit abstract. So in the beginning, for the exposition chapter, and actually there's a series of chapters, I have people start by kind of framing their story in the current chapter. Because the current chapter is where the protagonist is being asked to grow. And it's where change can happen. So I have people, like you did before in the opening meditation, I have you kind of describe the title of the chapter and give a description. And then I have readers do what's called a character sketch. And for those of you who are familiar with fiction writing, it's what authors will often do before they begin to write a novel. They'll kind of flesh out the characters. And why do they do that? They want to understand how their characters are going to evolve over the course of the story, how they may respond to the various plot tensions and twists, and they want to get a sense of like where that character is going to move. So I have people do it with the character of their story, which is you or them, and I ask those kind of questions I asked in the opening meditation. Who is the protagonist? What does he or she want? What's getting in the way? What are the stakes? And after all, every character has a particular arc over the course of the story. He or she starts out a certain way, has a certain set of belief, or has a certain set of skills, or a certain amount of insight, and they're challenged in some way that pushes them to evolve or not evolve based on the decisions they make or refuse to make. So I have people sort of understanding that. I want people to get a sense of how they're situated in their story. So once they've done that, then I ask them to sort of explore the roles that they're playing in their lives, the scripts that they're living, what's working and what's not working. And then I have them play with the power of spin by playing with like mood and tone. And so once the exposition is done, of course, we move on to the conflict. And the conflict I really consider sort of like the meat of the book. Or rather, I'm actually a vegetarian, so you might consider like veggie burger of the book between like the whole wheat, multigrain buns. And so this is kind of like the heart of the book. And actually I'm going to read kind of, what I try to do is sort of reframe what conflict really means. Because a lot of people, when I say conflict, people have like a cringy feeling in their bodies, because it doesn't conjure all these positive image. But in the world of stories, they are absolutely a necessary part of the story. So I'm going to read a little bit from how I introduce the conflict chapter. So it's the title of this chapter is Conflict, the Ultimate Character Workout. Have you ever noticed that the same type of character keeps showing up in your life and pushing all your buttons? These people may look nothing alike or even share the same gender, but they keep presenting you with more or less the same frustrations and issues. Or perhaps it's not a certain person, but a certain negative situation that you always find yourself struggling with. Perhaps you're always picking up the slack, and yet your contributions are never appreciated. Maybe you keep dating high-maintenance women or neglectful men. Why do these characters and situations keep appearing in your storyline? In story terms, these are the antagonists of our narrative, And while we may not like or appreciate them, they play an instrumental role in shaping our plot lines and our character. Usually when I introduce the concept of an antagonist in my writing workshops, people want to know how they can make the antagonist of their story disappear. While I empathize with that sentiment, having entertained similar thoughts myself, I encourage my writers to take a wider view. Instead, I propose a potentially more productive, if not more satisfying, question. Why has this protagonist or antagonist situation appeared in my story, and what does he or she have to teach me? Framed this way, an antagonist presents us with an invitation. When our antagonist shows up, do we run away, turn our heads, or surrender to the way things are while hoping for the best? Or do we rise to meet these challenges, embracing our antagonist if he, she, or it were a full-body toning instrument designed to open our heart muscles and build up our resistance to the gravity of life? What opportunities for personal growth would we miss if these obstacles simply disappeared? To answer this question, we need to understand more about the nature of conflicts in stories and the role antagonists play in helping the hero of the story stretch beyond his or her perceived limitations. Many of us don't think twice about pushing ourselves to the point of pain and exhaustion at the gym. Yet when life pushes us to exercise our emotional, spiritual, or mental muscles, we would often prefer lighter, gentler, no-impact routines. But until we are willing to build these character development muscles, we will remain somewhat stunted in our growth, unable to actualize the full strength of what we are capable of, whether in our career, relationships, or communities. Conversely, the more toned and refined we grow, the easier it becomes to do the emotional heavy lifting, and the freer we are from internal strife. And the freer we are from internal strife, the more energy we have to share our gifts with others, right? So character development doesn't really occur in a vacuum. And what I do is through a number of different chapters, I have a number of different writing exercises that help people sort of explore the inner story around the outer story of their conflict. What does that mean? So every story has an outer story, which are kind of like the newscast version of what happened, right? You know, you went on vacation and it rained 5 days, and and you ended up getting a really nice hotel room because they screwed up your reservation. Whatever it is, right? It's like the news. So so that's the outer story. The inner story is how we experience things. So usually, in order to change, a lot of people, they want to always change their outer story, but they don't always look at what inner story is keeping them from making those changes in their lives. Thank you. Thank you. So what I do is I help people explore their inner story. And sort of using the metaphor of the personal trainer, I help them. One of the ways I do that is I help them sort of identify and isolate the flabbier muscles in their lives. So that might be something like, maybe they have issues around trust, right? Or maybe they have issues around fear. And I use some literary devices like dialogues to have them explore what those, what the sort of the underlying, to actually access the various voices that aren't always very accessible to get ahead of those stories. And I also, in addition to having them identify their vulnerability, what I call their vulnerabilities, I also help them figure out what their growing edges are, which would be the opposite of their vulnerabilities, where they want to evolve to, and to dialogue with that voice inside of themselves. And I actually call it their growing edges. And I think it's best illustrated with an example. So I'm just going to read a short example with someone who was working on developing the muscle of courage. So the protagonist says, "Courage, how can I access more of you?" Courage says, "First, know that I'm inside you, have always been there since you took your first little baby steps." The protagonist says, "But why do I have trouble finding you?" Courage says, Fear made you think that I had gone away, but I lay nestled like a lion under your security blanket, waiting for you to pull the covers off and exclaim, let's go, it's time to take a stroll through the jungle. The protagonist says, ha ha, you have a great sense of humor, Courage. Wish I could find the humor when I'm in my fearful place. Life seems so serious then, like every choice I make has monstrous consequences. Courage says, the monster is not the consequence, the monster is the fear. The protagonist says, yes, but it feels so big. And the Courage says, so shrink it down and put it in its proper place. If you can be slightly more courageous than you are afraid, you'll be in good shape. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. Right? So we all have these kind of voices inside of our head that we don't always access. So like if people are like dialoguing with fear, I'll have them talk back to fear. And again, the other, okay, sorry, I'm getting a little lost here. Oh, right. So I also have people kind of using, if people are familiar with Joseph Campbell's work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he talks about how like in every hero in all of mythology always has like some of the same, like they always have, when they go out, set out on their journey and they're faced with trials and tribulations, they always have like supporting characters and tools and resources and that help them through navigate this, their conflict. So I offer give people an opportunity to identify those supporting characters and resources. And then finally, we've got, like we started with the exposition, and then, there's the conflict, and we hit the climax. And in all the movies and stories that we read traditionally in the classic, mythology stories, the hero destroys and, vanquishes the villain. But in the world, but in our lives, like it really is about slaying our own internal dragons, right? So that's what I help people do. I have people I offer dialogues, an opportunity for people to dialogue with their antagonists, and I provide guidelines so that it doesn't digress into an argument. And what I also do is I was really trying, when I was developing the climax section of the book, I was really struggling with how to organize it because I thought to myself, we can't really always control, we don't really know what the climax is going to be. A lot of times people have a lot of anxiety when they're going through something, they think, and they're worried about what that climax is going to look like. So I thought, well, we could do a best case scenario, have people envision their best case scenario and their worst case scenario, and usually it's something in between. And so I asked people to do that. But I wanted something more. I wanted people to feel like they could be truly empowered regardless of how their story unfolded. And then I realized that I was thinking about the story of, people are familiar in the Bible, of Jacob, and how he's wrestling. In the beginning of the story, he wants this blessing from his father, and he doesn't know how to ask for it, so he disguises himself. And he's and then his brother finds out, and he's really furious and chases him, and he runs away. And eventually, he's and a lot of things happen to him, and eventually he learns that his brother is coming to meet him, and he gets really scared and he wrestles with an angel. And while he's wrestling with that angel, which is kind of like wrestling with himself, he insists on a blessing. And I thought to myself, isn't that really the thing though? What if you can't ask for a blessing unless you know you deserve one. So I thought to myself, if people could walk away from whatever climate that they were facing and know that they deserve that blessing, no matter what. Whether they won the battle or not, that they did their best, or that they, so what I do is I have people actually give themselves a blessing in the climax chapter. And I can just read kind of how I introduce that. I thought I had marked that here. Nope, I did. Okay. Even if you can't predict the climax of your story, feeling ready to step up to the challenges presented by the narrative conflict is often half, if not the entire battle. After all, before you can conquer your antagonist, you need to conquer whatever vulnerabilities, including fears, doubts, resentments, or misgivings, are preventing you from progressing to the next chapter of your narrative. Some internal struggle typically precedes the resolution of any conflict. What if you felt so mentally, physically, and emotionally ready to face the challenges ahead that your sense of confidence and empowerment was success enough, so that you wouldn't even have to win the battle? Metaphorically speaking, what if you could ask your antagonist for a blessing, knowing you deserve one without it mattering whether or not you received it. This would be a beautiful climax indeed. So that's sort of the rationale for that chapter. And then I go on. There's another chapter that called Falling Action. That's all about getting the closure that you need. And then I have a resolution section where it's called Finding the Silver Lining Narrative, where I invite people to imagine how they, and if they were reading a story that left them feeling inspired, how they would want to envision that story, how they would want the story to unfold, and what they would need to do to make that happen. And then I have people identify morals and themes and start thinking about the next chapter of their story. And then in the end, I ask people to step back into their story in the first person and plug all the elements of the story into this neat little 2-page Mad Libby type of exercise that kind of summarizes it all, and it gives them a sense of the overall picture of where they are in their story and what they want and what's getting in the way and where they're moving. And I tell them they can put this on their refrigerator, they can put it in their wallet, So this is sort of the takeaway. And then for those who are really ambitious, I have at the end of the book, it's called My Life Story, which breaks down your life into various decade intervals, decade-long chapters, and you can assign a different chapter to each of those decades and identify the plot summary, the conflict, the supporting characters, the climax, the resolution, and what you learned and how you grew. So that is really the book. And now I guess I'll take questions from the audience. Yes?
You've described a model pattern for writing a story. Is this a pattern or model that your agents, I wouldn't say imposed, but suggested to you? Or is this a pattern that you have worked out on the basis of maybe your workshops?
Well, actually, it was my own idea. And it was based on, I was a literature major in college. I always loved the story structure. And again, as I said in the preface, it's kind of like I saw myself as a character in the story. And when I was going through hard times, I would try to sort of situate myself in that story. It was just, I studied a lot of, I just love, I love reading. And I love stories about character development, and I just sort of see these basic patterns and think that I thought that they would be helpful for people if people could find a proper framework. Because I think when people are feeling really struggling, they sometimes lose sight of sort of the bigger picture, and they feel like they're lost, and they need some guidelines to get them back on track. And I thought that this particular structure was so easy and so universal and something that people already knew that it was very accessible. So yes, it was my own idea, but it didn't come from my agent. Yes?
You do therapy and therapy groups. Do you use these techniques in there?
Yeah, I primarily do these techniques in workshops. And sometimes with clients, I'll sign I'll say, do this chapter. Now that I have a book, for a while it was handouts, So it's only since June that I've actually had an actual book to give people and say, okay, go to chapter. I think you really should do the climax, the protagonist blessing exercise in chapter 13. But it's people have I did a workshop at the JCC of Manhattan 2 weeks ago, and I actually had a psychoanalyst in there who was part of a psychoanalytic writing group, and she told me that she had more insights into the single writing workshop that I did than she had in her analytic group, and she took it to her, her own therapist, and who was and they really discovered some new stuff. So, it was just the best thing you could tell an author. Yes.
Do you find that this framework works best if you have a coach or a therapist such as yourself working, or is this something you can work through on your own?
Oh, you can absolutely do this on your own. I mean, it might bring up stuff that you might want to bring to a therapist, but I don't think you really need. I mean, this is designed to be your classic self-help book. If something comes up that it feels like it's too sensitive or vulnerable and you want to share with, that's fine. But really, this is not designed to be. It's not a companion. It's not designed to be something that complements or supplements something else. Yes.
It's a very interesting perspective.
Oh, thank you. Fred?
Maybe you could, in terms of your workshops, one of the things you talked about is developing characters.
Yeah.
And very often, the characters that we develop about ourselves are very much, I guess, imposed upon us, or the stories of our basic character are even unconscious assumptions about ourselves that are developed by our parents or
Right.
teachers or other people in our community.
Right.
And we project that forward. And some of those are very disempowering senses of the self. And so therefore, in some ways, like we choose events in our lives. Like there are an infinite number of events in our lives that we could create meaning with. And we sometimes choose those events in life that confirm the character that we are assigned.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
when you're working in these workshops, these writing workshops, how do you get people to break through to new kind of development of their own character or own understanding of themselves?
Well, we have actually. I mean, again, I want people to buy the book. So, but you can come to a workshop too. There will be more of them, and you can go to my website to find out more. But stepoutofyourstory.com. But ultimately, there's a section in the book called I think it's called "Who's Writing Your Script," and it explores the scripts that we were given, and it looks at like whether scripts are sort of whether they are ill-fitting, like whether somebody else wrote them for us and they don't really fit us, or poorly written. Maybe we've written a script about ourselves and it's not really like a full script. So I have people look at those scripts that they're living by and rewrite them. But part of reframing your story this way, of looking at like, I went through this and I grew this way, by telling your story as a personal growth adventure, you are reframing your story. You're starting to see how you can become empowered. And that, in effect, is one way to actually rewrite the script, is to look at your life differently. But sometimes
could you share with us, like, in your workshops, a specific story that particularly made an impression on you, of somebody that you worked with, and how it impacted their own sense of self?
Well, there's a lot of
maintaining confidentiality,
right.
Of course.
No, I mean, there's a lot of examples. There's a lot of examples in the book. I talk about this guy, I call him Seymour, who was someone who had done a lot of exploring in his outer life, but really hadn't kind of explored his inner life very much. And because he wasn't really looking within and only looking without, his story wasn't really unfolding the way he wanted it to, or he wasn't really happy with what he was getting. So that was one person who, using these exercises, and he was a personal client, and I helped him sort of reframe his story that way. There was also a woman I was working with, and she's also in the book, who was okay, so one thing I talk about in the story that is the antagonist of your story doesn't have to be like a negative event. It can also be, it's the person or the situation that's pushing you to stretch and grow as a human being. And so and sometimes it's like a positive thing, right? I mean, for me, this book was like the antagonist of my story for 2 years. As some of you who went on this journey with me will know. It took me a year to write a bad book and another year to write a much better good book. and it really stretched me to become the kind of character that could write a book. So it was, what was I saying? I had a client who was actually, her antagonist of her story was her mother, and the conflict was the fact that she was getting married and her mother wanted her wedding to be a certain way, and she had always wanted to please her mother. But the way that her mother wanted to have her wedding was not the way that she wanted to have her wedding. And it was like she and her fiance were butting heads with the mother in big ways, and it was creating all of her attachments to her mother. She was so afraid she did something that, went against her mother's values, that, her mother would, disapprove of her and cut her off. And so one of the exercises that she did was called, the protagonist's blessing is give herself the blessing that she wanted from her mother. Because we weren't sure that her mother was ever going to come around and say, oh, honey, it's okay that you did this and this and not that and that. And we weren't sure what was going to happen, but I wanted her to feel good about it. So I'm like, what is the blessing that you want to give yourself? So that was how she, one example of how she used that particular chapter. Yes?
So this sounds wonderful, and I was just thinking I'm going to walk out of here with this and probably not do anything. And even though I have all the desire to do it, and I was thinking, why is that? And there's so many distractions in life, and making the time for self-reflection and personal growth is so hard, and it's so scary, and there's even some shame involved. What am I going to find in there? And I'm wondering if you have any strategies, because the way you presented so far is assuming that we all have this, which we all probably for here, we have this good faith desire to go on this journey. But what are the strategies to make sure that we do it, And if you have a weekly group, or you have a therapist, or it maybe happens in a more disciplined fashion, but otherwise, people are wed to their phones and their jobs and their they're going from one to the other, and we're here because we're trying not to be. But what happens when we walk out?
Well, I probably shouldn't tell you how many self-help books I've bought with the intention of doing the exercises that, I've never done. So I think it's what you're describing is very human. That being said, so you're kind of asking what really motivates? What if you're not how do you get the motivation to do the work? People who've done the exercises in this book have said to me, it's a real workout. It really is. It's a workout, and I wouldn't say that it's for everybody. I would not say that. Although somebody actually wrote to me yesterday and said she's actually done the exercises twice, which I think is pretty incredible, and made me feel really good. So I guess I would say that I'm going to actually say I'm going to contradict myself. What I write in the book is I say, do the exercises in order, because each one takes you on is going to kind of leads to the next kind of naturally. And so I'm going to contradict myself and say it's okay to pick and choose. If you open the book and you see a chapter that really speaks to you, and that just feels like where you are, you might want to if it feels too overwhelming to do all of the exercises, just read through, skim it, and pick the ones, and maybe eventually you'll go back and do the rest. I think just be figure out, first of all, if you're really feeling stuck. If you're in a really stuck place, then maybe you want to make a commitment to do the whole process. Maybe you want to say to myself, I'm going to do this for myself. I'm tired of the same old story. I'm tired of getting stuck. I want to rewrite a new story. I'm going to do all of the exercises in the book, and then, and see where you are at the end of that. But, everybody has their own pace, and maybe you'll do one or two, in the next month. And maybe in a few months, you'll come back to it and say, I think I want to do the whole book. I guess just be gentle with yourself. I certainly don't want to push it on anyone and have people feel bad that they're not doing the writing exercises. That's, shame on that. That should never happen. But you shouldn't feel ashamed if you don't do all the writing exercises. And what I'm hoping to do actually, once I kind of figure out the technology of it, is to start offering workshops online and to be able to do this. So I think when you have this structure of a group, it makes it a lot easier to do these things. And then you can get feedback. And that's actually been some of the most kind of, I found the workshops are amazing when people really share and they learn so much. I totally believe in groups, and people learn so much from each other's experiences. And this actually started as a 3-hour workshop at the 92nd Street Y 8 years ago. And then it became an 8-week, it actually became a 5-week workshop, and people wanted to go longer. It became 8 weeks. But that group really gelled, and actually 2 of the women in the group were big, huge people who were advocates for me creating a book out of it. They were like, this has to be a book. So I was like, okay. And I honored them at the New York books, book signing.
Yeah, I'm interested in the concept of this narrative line.
Right.
And your suggestion of taking, doing the exercises where you are today and going forward. But, there are so many key episodes you experience in life from early childhood
Right.
to adolescence.
Sure.
Are there any really key pieces where you feel this technique is particularly useful to people?
I think if people, well, usually what happens in the past, if it hasn't been resolved, shows up in the present. So the present is always a really good starting point. There are exercises in this book that kind of point to the past and help people work through the past. I just think sometimes, first of all, it was just a lot easier to focus everything in the present moment. I think people get overwhelmed sometimes. They don't know when to start writing, they want exploring, they're not sure where to start. I'm sure a very creative person could figure out how to use these exercises in a previous chapter, but it's really designed to change your story. So maybe you'd get something out of doing the life inventory in the back, but I think kind of exploring you might, like, let's say you identified a script that felt like it was really entrenched in your past. Well, you could either go and talk about it with a therapist, and they would love that, or you could, I could write another book about how to do that, but that's another book. But thank you for asking that. Okay.
To me, it would depend on where you are in your own life, about reflecting, in my case, more on the past, yes, the present going forward, but, there's some very young people here, and this seems to be a good framework of working through these issues now and moving forward. But have you met people who have been their own antagonists?
Yeah, I think no, never, ever. Especially not me. Well, I mean, that's kind of like the secret. That's like the secret underlying premise of this book, is that, like, oftentimes we are our own inner antagonists, and it's like by rewriting these scripts and dialoguing with all of these different strengths and vulnerabilities and growing edges, that we can kind of like really we can sort of in some ways not only diffuse our antagonists but understand them better and welcome them for whatever they're there to teach us.
Thank you.
I think the Buddhists call it like your enemy. What is like are there any Buddhists in the audience? There's like a divine, like when you have
The near enemy.
what?
The near enemy.
Maybe it's like, yeah, there's a term that describes, like, when you have a difficult person in your life, they're like something teacher. I can't remember what the phrase is, but that's kind of what it's about. Looking at whoever you're difficult. And again, like, this isn't always about difficult stuff. Like, some people, like, maybe getting married is really like stretching them and bringing up a lot of anxiety. That's a really good thing. Having a baby, right? That's a really good thing that can push a lot of people into like a lot of anxiety, and they want to explore, what's this about? How can I be responsible? Any other questions? Yes, Ronnie.
So what is, in many stories, fate plays a role, coincidence, things happen out of the blue, it
Right.
feels like.
Yeah.
So what do you do with those kind of, and what happened to you,
Right.
bad odds of that collection of incidents happening to any one person?
Well, yeah.
So, does that play a role in people's narratives too, or is it all kind of psychological?
I'm not sure I'm not sure I understand the question completely. Does that do
Like the plot, the external plot,
Right.
The war that came, the depression that came, the terrible accident that occurs.
Well, it's all about finding meaning in those stories. So it's not like things happen in your story, and again, it's all about how do you make meaning of it. And that's what this book is really designed to do. It's about, we're like, as people say, we're meaning-making machines, and how do we find meaning in our story? Well, if we can see our stories as the things that happen to us, these sometimes, and I have people identify certain themes. Maybe they're like certain themes keep showing up, or morals keep showing up in your story, and lessons, and I have people identify those. But it's really about taking those experiences and asking myself, how can I grow from this? Because what other choice do you really have? I mean, you could get stuck in your victim story, right? And that's kind of like, well, so this is sort of a way of contradicting the victim story. This is about creating an empowering narrative that contradicts your victim story and leaves you, so how can I make meaning from this? How can I grow from this experience? Because the opposite is that, and I think, unfortunately, that's when people become, often times people do become, you know, depressed or discouraged, or because they get stuck in their victim story, and this is really designed to turn that around. Anybody else? All right, thank you so much. Florida. Thank you.
Nice Q&A.
Okay.
All right, folks, so if there are no more questions, then a note to our internet audience watching at home. Still time for you to call the number on your screen, and we could ship a copy of Step Out of Your Story to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have the book for sale at the counter in the front room over there. Kim's going to be signing here at the table to the left of the podium, and this was such a nice presentation. Please give Kim Schneiderman another hand. Thanks very much. Thank you, Kim.